everyone. I think we are nearing 12:30, and I think at this point I can begin our session. I'm going to ask Virginia, are you able to adjust your screen a little bit so we can see a little bit more of you, Virginia? Oh no, thank you so much. Oh, thank you. So, well, welcome back, everyone. It is an absolutely extraordinary pleasure for me to introduce today's conference keynote speaker. Virginia Gamba has served as the UN Secretary General's Special Representative for Children and Armed Conflict. She held that position for 8 years, and she concluded her tenure only very, very recently. Prior to that very demanding role, Virginia's work at the UN covered many things, but amongst them disarmament, arms control, but including, notably, from my point of view at least, the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Virginia's work at the UN builds on other career-long contributions. She was program officer at the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago, and that was where I first knew her and recognized her commitments to a better world and her abundant energy. Virginia is a multi-volume author, and she's worked as an academic lecturer at American University in Washington, D.C., at King's College in London, and at a major think tank in Pretoria, South Africa. For me, I have to say personally that Virginia personifies much more than what we typically associate as internationalism, but something I would really describe as worldly or human empathy. And in that spirit, as you'll see from Virginia's bio on the conference documentation, Virginia is preparing, I'm happy to say, in early 2026, she will launch a campaign to succeed Antonio Guterres as Secretary General of the United Nations. Now, I should say organizationally that after Virginia makes her remarks of 30 minutes or plus or so, she has agreed to engage with us in some Q&A. So I ask the audience members if you would submit your comment or your question, and if you would do that in the Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen, that would be a great pleasure. So Virginia joins us today from her home in Argentina, and I am absolutely delighted to extend a very warm welcome to give our keynote address today. Virginia, the floor is yours, and welcome.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. Well, first, I'm delighted to be here. One, I would not do this for anyone else except Jeffrey Weissman. And he reminded me when we met and how everything started. And it has been a long road, but it's been a good one. So we've discussed a little bit what I would be talking to you about. I'm also prepared to answer any questions on any topic that you think I might be able to assist you with. But the topic at hand that is really interesting is children in armed conflict. As you will see with my bio, I'm not an expert on children. I'm not a lawyer. I don't even know if I really like children that much. I've only got one daughter, so I'm thinking about it. But I do want to say that once Secretary General Guterres took me out of the chemical weapons file and gave me the command of the Children in Armed Conflict file, I came to really respect it. And I found it extremely interesting, perhaps one of the most interesting files I've ever worked on. And I hope to share that enthusiasm for it with you today. To make a very long story short, since this is a course about diplomacy in turbulent times, you can't understand the different departments, dockets, or offices at the United Nations, or for that matter, in other regional international organizations, unless you know your history and you remember the critical period of time when doctrine changes. Doctrine changes. So when the Children in Armed Conflict file emerged is at the moment in time when we've just finished with the Cold War. Again, critical. we used to all live under a doctrine over the Cold War that was about peace and security. Peace could not exist without security, and you couldn't have security without peace. It was very simple, but it was really governed by things like deterrence and by escalation and limitations and containment. It really didn't have a human face. When the thaw came from 1986-87 onwards, what we started seeing was the rise of a new concept to try to replace the one of peace and security. And this new concept eventually, in the annual report of the UN Department or UNDP, the development portion of the United Nations, came up with a name for it and a definition. And this happened in 1994, and it was called the human security concept, where here you started adding things to peace and security. So it was first peace, security, and development. Then it became a multiple variation on a theme. Out of the human security construct that emerges in 94 came a lot of derivations. Between 94 and the year 2000, we have multiple derivations of the human security concept. Among the many derivations, you have the rise of the women, peace, and security concept. You do have the emphasis on stopping the illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons. You also have got a real push to try to engage on limitations of conventional weapons as well. This is the era of the great conventions. Why? Because the Security Council finally is able to agree in the post-Cold War era. It unleashes the power of the Security Council to act collectively towards collective security. And so in that period of time, the face of human security, paradoxically, today we would say it's civilians, is the protection of civilians. But at the time, the face of the protection of human security was children. And this happened for a very specific reason. Between 1995, 1994, 1995, 1996, we started, the UN Secretary General at the time was Boutros Ghali, and he started really calling attention on the fact that small arms, firearms, conventional weapons were really weapons of mass destruction in the southern part of the globe, in the regions that were emerging from conflict or were still entrenched in a conflict that had been brought about for whatever reason. It could have been proxy wars, it could have been rebellion, it could have been repression, but for whatever reason it was, the small arms were causing havoc. Because of that emerges an instinct in Boutros Ghali to try to determine what is happening, what's the impact of the other side of security, the impact of the insecurity that the inhabitants in most of the world were living. How could it be measured? And so he ordered a study, and he commanded Graça Machel, the former First Lady of Mozambique and afterwards former First Lady also of South Africa, to go to the field, have a team together, work with UNICEF, and start documenting, mostly in Africa, which was at the center of the violence at that point in time, to document how and what the impact was on human security of weapons. And out of this emerges a terrifying finding. By 1999, she produces a report, which became historic, to show, demonstrate, verify that children, particularly children in Africa, were being recruited and used as child soldiers in extreme ways. So they were being used and abused by armed groups. Terrorist groups at the time were less than armed groups themselves and rebels. And they were being exploited. The children were being exploited. So when she presented the report to the General Assembly in 1999, it was a no-brainer. The General Assembly took a historic decision. It was the decision 5177 of the year, I'm sorry, 96, not 99, 96. And at that time, they created me, i.e., they created the job of Special Representative of Secretary General on Children and Conflict, and they created an office within the Secretariat to handle this file. Originally, it was only supposed to be, when it was created in December 1996, it was just supposed to document and perhaps advocate with all member states and armed groups as well, about the need to stop the recruitment and use of children for war purposes, the use and abuse of children for because of armed conflict. So that was the beginning of it. It gave the face to human security. You would, if you study that period of time, 96 to 99, 2000, you're going to see emerging from that interlocking system where women, peace and security, small arms proliferation control, children and conflict become intertwined in this nexus between prevention, protection, post-conflict reconstruction, and the weapons of war in itself, the mentality of where the children stood in all of this. This is the era of the great conventions, including the Ottawa Convention against anti-personnel landmines. A very interesting moment in time. Immediately after that, the creation of that office, I finished 2 months ago my stint. I was a fourth special representative. The Children and Conflict file, aside from its horrible acronym, which is CAC, I mean, really, you have to be a bit more creative than that. It flourished in such a way that within 3 years, the Security Council took it over. And the Security Council decided this is something that really interests us. We really want to start monitoring and understanding the dimensions of the grave violence against children, not just recruitment and use of children. What does it mean for us? What does it mean for peace and security? What does it mean for development? What does it mean for women, peace and security? So there was this attempt by the Security Council to start putting some order on the CAC agenda. So by 1999, with the first Security Council resolution on CAC, the decision was to create the first and only formal working group of the Security Council on a human security aspect of the peace and security agenda, is the Children and Conflict Working Group of the Security Council, which meets regularly. It's the one that meets the most of the 8 committees or workshops that exist, or working groups that exist within the Security Council. And this one is the one that works also the hardest, frankly. They started meeting in they created it themselves. So they created that in 1999. And since then, there have been almost 15 Security Council resolutions on different aspects of the Children and Conflict agenda, each one to be implemented by the office that I used to lead in New York. Over time, the one grave violation against children, i.e. recruitment and use of under 18-year-olds, was a long discussion, 15 or 18-year-olds, under 18-year-olds, that says the Convention on the Rights of the Child and its optional protocol against the recruitment and use of child soldiers. Very quickly, the Security Council decided that they can't just advocate. They need to understand the volume of the problem and the ramifications of this problem. So they created what is called the Monitor and Reporting Mechanism on Children and Armed Conflict, which was the first mechanism of its type that works in an interdisciplinary manner and also across different dimensions of the UN system. So you have monitors. The monitors do not belong to the Office of the Special Representative. The monitors exist in the agencies, departments, and offices of the UN that are in the country offices of the United Nations. So it depends who is present in a country, whether it's ILO, or whether it's UNDP, or whether it is UNICEF, or whether it's OHCHR, whichever agency is present, as well as the national coordinator of the UN in that country, is responsible for monitoring on a 3-monthly basis to the office of the special representative, verified cases of violations against children in their purview. That information arrives in New York. It's collected from the field by UN officials through the use of this monitoring reporting mechanism guideline, which is the most strict guideline for monitoring that has been created so far. It's far more strict than anything that the human rights people, departments, or bodies in Geneva can produce. And it's nothing to do with committees or people are going or rapportering about an abuse in the field. It is really very technical. It's very complex. You have to be trained to be able to be a monitor on CAC, and only UN officials can do that by the decree of the Security Council. So the Security Council created a body for itself to monitor. It created a system to monitor with, which was a monitor reporting mechanism. And then after that, decided to start ordering not just advocacy and monitoring. There had to be reporting by the Secretary General annually to the Security Council, not just on what was the status of violations against children in situations of armed conflict, define armed conflict, that's another story, but also who were the major perpetrators of those violations, which is incredibly complex because the minute you start attributing guilt, attributing perpetration to both state actors and non-state actors, it becomes a really difficult tool to handle. No one wants to be on the CAC lists. Every year, the Secretary General must, what we call list, add in the attachment of the annual report the names of the parties to conflict, whether governmental or non-governmental, that have been proven and verified by a UN official on the ground as having committed one of the violations against children. Again, to cut the long story short, over the course of the years, the Security Council was able to identify more than one violation. So although it started with recruitment and use of child soldiers, very quickly, over a lapse of about 10 years, every 2 years or so, the Security Council came up with a new resolution identifying a different grave violation. Today, my old office sits with 6 grave violations against children only in situations of armed conflict. These are recruitment and use, rape and sexual violence. There is killing and maiming of children. That's the third one. There's abduction of children. There is attacks on schools and hospitals and denial of humanitarian access to children. So all 6 violations are monitored permanently by the UN on the ground through their officials using the MRM mechanism. That is reported to the office in New York, who then compiles this information and presents every 3 months the findings to the Security Council, and once a year to the Secretary General, who then makes the call if he is going to advise a member state or an armed group that they have been identified as violators, and then a choice is given to them. And the choice is either you engage immediately with the United Nations to end and prevent that violation through what was called, and we call, a joint action plan between the party to conflict, whether governmental or not, and the UN. Usually, I was the one co-signing such joint action plans. These action plans, in a way, admit that the violation is being committed, but they do not condemn. It's not a judicial process. The Secretary General's annual report to the Security Council doesn't have legal standing. It really is not a judicial process. What its purpose is to change the behavior immediately and rescue the children. So the idea is to prevent violations against children from happening in the first place, protect and release those children that have been affected, and then assist the United Nations and its partners, now civil society, to reintegrate support survivor children back into the community. So it is complex. It has many variations. The reintegration variation is as important as the prevention variation. To give an example, for example, I remember we were very successful in negotiating in South Sudan, in the Central African Republic, for stopping violations against children by government forces. And then the government immediately released thousands of children that they had recruited. So many, in fact, and so quickly, in fact, that there was no money, resources, or personnel to be able to absorb them back into civilian life. So as a result of that, UNICEF has always been poorly funded for reintegration purposes, was only able to reintegrate 50% of those children released. The other ones were left in the street. They had, and most possibly did, go back and for re-recruitment because they had nowhere else to go. So it's as important to stop re-recruitment as it is to prevent. You have to educate. You do that through the joint action plans. The joint action plans are long-term efforts that put in place jointly between the parties and the UN what needs to happen to stop the practice. And that might mean, if you're a government, change your child laws. It might mean to criminalize the 6 grave violations in your legislation so that you can, in fact, catch those that are doing these atrocities. So it has got a lot of accountability, but at national level. It doesn't go to the ICC, it goes at national level courts. But it also has things like changing the recruitment processes. One of the biggest problems that we found in the field to this day, and I'm putting it to you as just an enigma, is that most of the countries in conflict today have got very weak birth registration systems. So who knows what the age of a child is? In fact, who knows how many children are abducted in the world today in countries that have got weak birth registration systems or identification papers? Because most of these children are non-entities. They don't exist even on paper. So how are you going to trace them if they're being abducted for sexual purposes, for example, or sexual trafficking? So I think I'm trying to give you an overview of what the office does and what the purpose is. There's been a lot of confusion where the assumption was that it's some type of legal court that determines attribution and seeks punishment. That was not and is not in the language of the Security Council resolutions. It is simply to monitor and verify through a UN official that the violation occurs, attribute when possible a perpetrator. And then my job used to be, as soon as the Secretary General named the perpetrator, I had to call that perpetrator. And I said, hello, you're on the blacklist now. So what are we going to do about it? Do you want us to sit down now and start negotiating and creating a joint action plan? If they did the joint action plan, and that meant a lot of things, whether you were an armed group or you were a government, if you were willing to work with the UN towards stopping the practice, whichever that was, then it would be recognized in the following year in the annual report. And there would be a set of steps that you had to take and a checklist that had to be monitored and verified. And invariably, if it was done correctly, you would see dropping numbers of violations year upon year. It was unbelievable. For example, from I remember in 2017, there was almost 7,000 child violations in South Sudan alone, just on recruitment. And by the year 2020, because they agreed in the year 2018 to do a joint action plan across all 6 grave violations, by the year 2021, that had been reduced to 300, under 300 verified children recruited. Every year since 2017, when I took over that docket, we were able to release between 12 and 14,000 children from war and pass them on to reintegration actors, which was UNICEF and its partners, which were mostly civil society organizations. So I think I've talked enough, and I want to stop there. I just tell you as a last bit, the countries that figure in the docket of CAC as armed conflict Whether you want to identify them as such or not is a different story. They are identified as such in the docket and in the Security Council. And the countries that I covered were Haiti and Colombia in the Americas, Philippines, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Pakistan and India, which now are out. They've completed their dossiers. In the Middle East, it was Yemen, Syria, Iraq, then, of course, the occupied Palestinian territories, Israel, Lebanon. Most of the cases are in Africa, in Europe, Ukraine. But in Africa, it's most of them. And this is Libya, Mali, Nigeria, Niger, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Cameroon, DRC, by far the most violent of all, Somalia, the second most violent of all, Ethiopia, Mozambique, and I think that's about it that I can remember right now. So now I'm very happy to answer any questions and answer any questions you have about that docket or anything else that you would like to discuss. Over to you, Jeffrey.
DePaul University, in fact, has recently been given special consultative status with ECOSOC.
Well done.
Yes, so
well done.
Very, very pleased with that, of course. And our colleague Liz Ward has been spearheading that, and we're thoroughly delighted about that. We have a very active Model UN organization on campus, and we have several members who've basically been listening to you today. And finally, our next panel, in fact, at 1:15, is on multilateralism at the crossroads, the United Nations and informal international organizations. And so again, I'm going to invite everyone to come back at 1:15 for that particular panel. That's in just 10 minutes or so. But before doing that, Virginia, thanks so much for introducing us to so much of the intricacies of the United Nations, its problems, but also its potentialities. And for that, we're very, very grateful. Thank you so much. And we wish you...
Thank you for having me. I was delighted. Thank you.
Thanks, Virginia.